This character you see here is a model I made for the video game, currently being developed by the studio where I work. 3D characters for games need to meet certain artistic and technical requirements, and in this video, I'll show you my entire process for reaching those standards, from the concept phase all the way to having an optimized model ready to use in Unity. It was a long journey that took me over 40 hours, condensed here into 40 minutes. I'll explain my workflow with Blender and Substance Painter, how I receive feedback from the team, and I'll share important tips that might help you. At the end, we'll do a complete analysis of the process, how long each stage took, the mistakes I made, and what I could have done differently to be more efficient. So, with that in mind, let's dive into this journey. Throughout this video, we'll cover the most important parts of the workflow. Even though my process isn't perfectly linear, these are always the pillars of any character creation process for video games. But before we start, I'd like to give you some context about the game, our character, and the technical requirements. The game we're creating is called Pawn Shot. It's a multiplayer platform game that mixes dodgeball mechanics with parkour. Basically, you have to hit your opponents with balls to defeat them. It started a few years ago as an academic project and became very popular in events and local tournaments. This year, we restarted development from scratch, now working as a small indie studio. Our character, Motita, is a very competitive and spoiled girl, obsessed with chewing gum and sticking the stickers she gets from the gum onto her body. Visually, she needs to look stylized with vibrant colors and keep a style similar to the first character. And technically, she can't have more than 80,000 triangles. She must use PBR textures, and of course be optimized for animation. With those parameters, we created the concept art using artificial intelligence. We generated images with AI and painted over them in Photoshop to adjust what we wanted to change, and iterated again with AI. At the moment, we don't have a concept artist in the studio, so we relied on this method. However, a concept artist would have made the process faster. So, with the concept ready, we started the modeling process in Blender. The first thing we always do when creating a character is block out the main volumes with very basic objects to establish the general structure. This is the first modeling stage, where we build the base shapes of our character. At this point, details don't matter, only the overall structure, proportions, and silhouette. The goal is readability. It's basically like sketching in 3D. Think of it as making a tri-dimensional draft, and everything we do here will affect the rest of the model. That's why it's so important to start solid, even with very simple silhouettes. This stage is perfect for fast testing without fear of making mistakes, because it's where corrections are easiest. The tools we use here are basically spheres that we deform in sculpt mode, giving them the shape of each body part. For example, I started with a simple sphere, stretched it, duplicated it, and shaped it into the main parts of the body: head, neck, chest, arms, and so on. At this stage, we also use very few modifiers. For now, I just use the mirror modifier to create the left and right parts at the same time. For the hands, I like to first model the palm and then create the fingers with small cubes. I stretch them and extrude the edges to build the silhouette. This gives me more initial control over the fingers. I add some loops to improve the shape. Then I add a subdivision modifier for more resolution, adjust it, and attach it to the palm. I also subdivide the palm to give it more resolution, and then I place and organize each finger one by one. This is a constant process of testing and adjusting. I duplicate until I have all the fingers, rotate and tweak them until I get a good general silhouette. Hands are probably the most complex part of blocking because of all the structures and the fact that each finger needs the right orientation to look natural from the start. Once I'm happy with the overall shape of the hand, I begin sculpting a bit more detail and surface volume. Anatomy is important here, but I try to avoid going into too much detail. I just mark the parts that are most noticeable without overworking it. A useful tip is to look at your own body. When sculpting body parts, even if you have image references, it helps a lot to observe your own hands, for example. You can check knuckles, joints, where muscles or tendons are more visible, and so on. Once I'm satisfied with the blocking, I integrate it with the rest of the body. I make all the adjustments needed and increase the resolution where the model requires it. Then I start adding a bit more definition. For example, I begin detailing the face by marking the eye sockets, adjusting the overall features, shaping the lips, and adding details like the nostrils. And for the ears, I just deform a cube until it gets a decent shape like this. For the eyes, I simply create a UV sphere and place it in the socket. Then I duplicate it, cut part of it, and use the solidify modifier to quickly generate eyelids. For the eyebrows, I follow a similar process. I create a plane, attach it to the head surface with the shrink wrap modifier, and also add solidify for some volume. Once the primary volumes are looking good, I move on to secondary ones, refining facial features and adding small parts like eyelashes. These are just extruded edges with a bit of volume. To be more confident with proportions, sometimes I bring the concept art image directly into Blender and adjust the blocking based on it. For the clothing pieces, I start with very simple models. For example, I extrude a circle to create the initial silhouette of the shorts. I add the mirror modifier, tweak it, and make sure it has enough resolution to adjust later in sculpt mode. For the top, I create a plane, attach it to the body with the shrink wrap modifier, and extrude it across the surface where the garment will go. Then I smooth it out in sculpt mode and refine it with subdivision and small sculpt tweaks. For the blouse that goes on top, I just duplicate that object, make some adjustments, and remodel it following the reference. Duplicating similar objects like this helps save a lot of time. Now I start adding modifiers to the clothes, giving them more volume. Since this is a stylized character, the fabrics need to look thicker. Once I have the basic body silhouette, I do a remesh so everything has a unified surface. After that, I smooth out any artifacts that remain to make sure the surface is clean. Then I start adding anatomical details like muscle shapes, bones, tendons, basically the features that will be noticeable on the surface. With this done, I move on to the hair. For the hair, I block it out using curves. I create one curve, then a second circular curve that will serve as the guide. This way, the first curve takes the shape of the second, letting me create hair strands that I place all over the head. I keep placing these strands across the scalp. It's a time-consuming process because there are many strands, and balancing them to look visually appealing takes patience. I cover the whole head surface this way. I also create a little bun at the back of the head. To speed things up, I duplicate some larger strand groups with mirror. For example, for the ponytail, I duplicate a bigger chunk of strands. With that, I complete this first stage, which is the initial blocking. A few final tips I want to emphasize here. The silhouette should always be the main focus. It needs to be clear and easy to read. Also, avoid the temptation of adding details too soon. Make sure proportions are clean first, because if something looks off now, it will still look off once you add detail. And finally, don't be afraid to experiment and make mistakes at this stage, because this is where corrections are easiest. With that, we had our first feedback session with the team. They gave me the following recommendations. First, adjust the proportions so the character matches the hitbox of the first character. I didn't fully agree. but it was a group decision. Second, make the hands a bit bigger, since they're a strong visual element for the game's mechanics. And third, start applying materials so we can better visualize how the character interacts with the environment and other characters. With those notes, I imported the first character into Blender, then adjusted Motita's proportions to look more similar. Basically, I modified the body and made the head bigger to look more childlike. I also adjusted the rest of the objects accordingly. Finally, I painted her in sculpt mode to give her temporary materials and start getting a sense of the look. I connected these colors in the node editor and also started applying flat colors to all the objects. For the eyes, which are going to have two materials on the same object, I created a mask by making different vertex groups and adjusted the size. When I added the pupil, I felt it wasn't looking the way I wanted. It actually started to resemble a certain character from Lazy Town, but we'll fix that later on. Now for the headphones, I used this model that I already had, which fit the character perfectly. I didn't model them from scratch for this project. I actually took them from an exercise in my Blender for Beginners course, where we cover modeling, sculpting, materials, and more. So, if you're interested in learning how to make things like this, I've left a link in the description. Alright, with that out of the way, let's move on with our model. What I'll do now is work on the inside of the mouth, and for that, I'll just open it up a bit, and then copy the mouth cavity from the first character, so I don't have to do it twice. With that, I perform a Boolean operation, and this way I generate the opening of the mouth. Then I polish it a little and refine the details so it stays slightly open. For the rest of the mouth's interior objects, the teeth and tongue, I simply copy the high poly versions from the first model and place them inside this one. I adjust them a bit so they fit properly, make a few tweaks in sculpt mode, and now the high poly teeth are fully ready. And with that, we can begin the retopology process. For this, I use an add-on I developed myself, which basically creates a plane with the shrink wrap, mirror, and subdivision modifiers, so it adapts to the selected high poly model. Even though it's a simple process, I feel it saves me a lot of time. With it, I start generating the main loops of the character's face. These loops have to be created in areas that will be animated the most, for example, around the eyes, the mouth, and the ears. Then, I start filling in all those loops with polygons until the whole surface of the head is complete. At this stage, it's extremely important to know which parts will deform the most, so that during animation, everything looks smooth and natural. Here, I also finished sculpting the ears, because until now, they were just blocked out. I refine them carefully, and then I can continue with the retopology. I fill in the rest of the ear area, add geometry where it was missing until the head is fully closed. The mouth area is a bit trickier because being internal geometry, it's harder to make it stick properly with shrink wrap, so it can take a little longer. After that, I fill in the remaining small gaps. For the rest of the body, I'm not going to retopologize from scratch. Instead, I take the model from the other character and adapt it slightly to match this new silhouette, until it fits the whole surface. Then I also apply shrink wrap so it sticks nicely, saving a huge amount of retopology time. Here, for example, I measure the edges so I can connect the neck to the rest of the body, redirect some loops so the vertex count matches, and keep adjusting areas that need to stick to the surface properly. It's a bit tedious, but definitely way faster than retopologizing the whole body manually. I continue with small adjustments so everything flows smoothly. Then I merge the head and body, smooth it out a bit, and with that, the body retopology is done. Now we move on to our second round of feedback, and the feedback I got was to bring the proportions back to the way they were before. So with that in mind, I'll continue with the shoes. I wasn't sure how they'd turn out, so I did some explorations using ChatGPT, and I got this concept that I really liked as a base. I also wanted to explore this website that generates 3D models with AI. I used it just as a starting point, refining and modifying until I had something close to the concept and that fit our character. From there, I removed unnecessary details, added new ones, and simplified large volumes like the laces, gradually adapting everything to the concept's design. Once I had a solid base, I duplicated the model and started smoothing it all over. I then extracted a low poly version using a quadrimesher. From that, I modeled each piece of the shoe manually. For example, all the leather layers, the sole, the padded areas, and so on. With this low-res model, I could easily apply modifiers and have much more control over the final silhouette. This way, everything looks sharper and more polished. So I continued with that same technique throughout the entire shoe, extracting shapes, smoothing them, adding modifiers, until all the pieces were complete. Honestly, this was an extremely tedious process because even though it's organic modeling, it also has elements of hard surface design. So even though the object is curvy, you have to control it carefully so it looks manufactured. Personally, this was the most exhausting part of the whole process. I'm not used to working with such controlled models. Now, for these finishing touches on the leather pieces, I model a line of vertices and then convert it into a curve. That way, I can easily control both the shape and the thickness of the outline. I add a few missing details this way. I also make the shoelaces using the same curve modeling technique. I make sure they look properly interlaced, carefully control their flow, add the knots at the ends, and with that, the laces are done. Finally, I add this little star that's part of the brand logo our character wears, as well as the S on the sides. And with that, the shoes are finished. It was a pretty heavy process, but really worth it for the result. Going back to the body, let's move on to the detailing stage. In this phase, we take the whole model we've built and polish the surfaces. I start by refining all the skin folds, adding anatomical details, and making sure the silhouette reads perfectly from every angle. It's also a good idea to change the preview material now and then, since it helps spot shapes we might miss with just one shader. I keep adding details. For example, here I'm modeling the underwear, making sure it sticks closely to the body so that during retopology, everything stays together. I keep refining anatomical details from top to bottom, focusing especially on visible areas. I also add the socks and keep working on the clothing details as well. This stage is basically about going over the entire body, looking for areas that need more attention, whether on the skin surface or on accessories. Here I add fingernails, which is a relatively simple process. I place a plane on top of the finger, give it some thickness with the solidify modifier, and repeat for all the fingers. Then I continue adjusting and detailing the body, identifying objects that need extra care. Once this is done, we move into sculpt mode for another detailing pass. For example, I sculpt clothing wrinkles, keeping in mind how fabric tension works. These small details make the material feel much more like real fabric. Surface relief helps communicate what kind of material it is, even before adding color. For the waistband, I experimented with cloth brushes in sculpt mode, but eventually decided to do a UV unwrap instead, and with that, I tried a displacement modifier. As you can see, I add a displacement with a noise texture, adjust it based on the UVs, until I get a pattern that resembles elastic fabric, like you usually see in this part of pants. I tweak the UVs a bit, scale the texture until I get a convincing result. Slowly, we get closer to that final look. Here, I also modeled some extra pieces I had skipped. For example, this little watch, which gives the character a lot of personality, and some wristbands that make her look more colorful. I add the numbers on the shorts, apply the necessary modifiers, add this chewing gum detail, and with that, the high poly model is finished. All the details of our character are in place. Let's go over some tips for this stage. The first is constantly rotate the model. Orbiting often helps you spot errors and asymmetries that might go unnoticed from other angles. Also, rely heavily on visual references, so we ensure that the shapes, proportions, and details are consistent with the style we're aiming for. And finally, every once in a while, change perspective. Work on one part of the model, then switch to a completely different area to keep detailing. With the high poly model ready, let's move on to optimization. First, we optimize the high poly itself. I simply apply a decimate modifier to reduce the mesh density. This makes the high poly much lighter to work with, while still keeping all the detail. So the model goes from nearly 10 million polygons down to about 500,000. And now, with the model optimized, I go back to adjust the low poly a bit more. I want to make sure the shapes properly follow the high poly surface, copying the silhouette and surface details as closely as possible. I make sure the loops fit the contours of the high poly model and that the silhouettes match each other with the right flow for animation. I keep optimizing the low poly, for example, with the cloth. Here, what I usually do is apply decimate using the unsubdivide method. That way, we recover the initial geometry. This gives me clean geometry without having to redo all the retopology. Still, I need to make some adjustments. For example, I subdivide the edges and triangulate them so the borders get a bit more resolution without increasing the density of the whole mesh. For some pieces, I prefer to create the retopology from scratch, like the shorts, which I do fully by hand since they're not very complex. I add the necessary geometry and keep repeating the same process across most of the objects that I subdivided, always thinking about saving time since the silhouette is already in place. For the laces, I use a similar process as with the cloth. I just apply decimate with the unsubdivide mode. Now, when it comes to the shoes, the geometry is already quite complex, so there I really have to do full manual retopology from scratch. It's a long and tedious process, but it's very important to preserve every single detail and keep the silhouette sharp, because in the game, the shoes are a strong visual element. And we also have to keep in mind that these models aren't just for gameplay, they're also used in cinematics. So let's go through this whole process quickly. For the hair, since it's made with curves, I simply duplicate each object and reduce the curve density. For models like the headphones, I extract part of the geometry, fill in some areas by hand, and then refine the silhouette. We do the same process with all the other objects like bracelets, the watch, and so on, simply reducing and optimizing the geometry. Finally, for the teeth, I merge them all into one mesh and apply a decimate modifier, since they're very simple and won't be visible most of the time. And with that, the retopology is finished. Some tips for this stage: always optimize with the silhouette in mind. Even if it's low poly, some contours really need that extra geometry. It's also extremely important to follow the anatomical loops, so the mesh deforms correctly during animation. And one last note, don't be afraid of using triangles. It's fine to add triangles in areas that don't affect the flow of the mesh. Alright, now I start assigning objects into different collections so I can keep my file organized. And from here, we move on to the UV unwrapping phase. This step is all about marking seams on the geometry so that we can unfold it and project it onto a two-dimensional texture. The idea is to place those seams in hidden areas so that different pieces of the character can open up completely. We do this all over the body, making sure everything ends up in separate islands. Once we have all the cuts defined, we unwrap and project the geometry onto UV space. At this stage, it's very helpful to add a grid texture. This helps us better identify the scale and density of each UV island. To make stretching more obvious, we can also enable stretching visualization in the viewport. That way, we can spot which areas are under the most tension and relax them. This will optimize the texture a lot more. Once I'm sure the unwrap looks good, I pack everything so that it fills the space properly. For the face, I purposely give it a bit more resolution since it's the most important visual point of the character. I repack everything and make manual corrections to distribute the islands as evenly as possible across the space. This is a process many people find tedious or stressful, but personally, I find it really satisfying. For me, it's like enjoying a puzzle. Here, for example, I realized I hadn't included some pieces, like the eyes, eyelashes, and eyebrows. So I unwrapped them separately, organized them a bit, and merged them with the rest of the UV layout. I repack everything again, including those objects, make a few more adjustments, and then repeat the process for the mouth parts that I had missed earlier. Once more, I organize everything so the islands make full use of the UV space, filling every available spot inside the square. Now let's move on to the hair unwrap, which is extremely simple. I just make a cut along each strand, and that gives me small islands. I apply the grid tool and add a preview texture. I also unwrap the small hair bun, which is very straightforward, and make sure it lines up with the rest. I want all these islands oriented in the same direction so that when I later apply the hair fibers, everything will be aligned correctly. I repeat the same process with clothing and accessories. I add a preview material, and with that, the UV unwrapping is finished. For this project, I ended up with 3 different UV layouts, which means 3 UV sets and 3 texture sets. One for the body, one for accessories, and one for hair. Now that the UVs are ready, let's move on to exporting. First, I make sure the low poly sits perfectly on top of the high poly with clean intersections. Then I select the high poly objects and the low poly objects one by one, separating them so that none of them are touching. This process is called exploding a model. We do it to avoid intersections during baking and also to prevent ambient occlusion from one object bleeding onto another. Each object should only calculate its own occlusion. With the objects separated, I start adding materials. Later, during texturing, I'll use these materials as ID masks, which saves me from having to paint masks manually. This step will save us a lot of time down the road. Once the materials are assigned, I export the high poly model in its exploded form and also the low poly model. Before exporting, I always add the triangulate modifier. This ensures the mesh is triangulated before baking, which makes the result consistent. When I hand off the model to the person who does the rigging, I always deliver 2 versions, the triangulated version and the non-triangulated version. That way, they can rig the clean mesh more easily. Now let's import the model into Substance Painter. Here we have the low poly, and as you can see, right now there's only one texture set. That happened because I forgot to assign materials to the low poly, so I go back to the low poly, select all the parts that share the same UV layout, and assign each one a different material. Substance Painter reads each material as a separate texture set. Now I have 3 texture sets. When I re-import into Substance Painter, they all show up correctly. Next comes the bake. I import the high poly to transfer all the details. For this, I'm going to use a new experimental feature in Substance Painter, available starting this year, 2025, Automatic Cage. This feature automatically detects the minimum and maximum distances needed for baking. However, since I have some mirrored objects in the high poly, I need to remove them first. If I don't, they cause artifacts during the bake. So I go back into Blender, select the mirrored duplicates, and delete them to keep only one side. I do the same for the headphones. Then I export the cleaned model again. Now, when I re-import it into Substance Painter, the automatic cage works perfectly. And with that, we can run the bake. Once the bake is done, you can see that all the high poly details are now projected onto the low poly mesh. Since I know it worked, I increased the quality a bit by adding anti-aliasing and run the bake again. This way, the result looks smoother, especially at the intersections of the geometry. I check the whole model carefully to make sure every surface looks correct. And now that I'm confident in the bake, I re-export the low poly model, but this time with everything collapsed. I apply the mirror modifier, reset all the parts back into their original positions, and export again. Once it's exported, I replace the original low poly inside Substance Painter with this final version. And now we have the baked model ready for texturing. To be very clear, all the high poly details are stored in texture maps, which are then projected onto the low poly mesh. With that explained, we move on to the next round of feedback. And this time the feedback was, everything is okay, so we can proceed. Before creating new materials, I like to first review how the materials were made for the first character. That way, I have a clear reference for consistency and style. For several of the materials, I actually build smart materials in Substance Painter. Then I just apply them directly and tweak them for efficiency. For the skin materials, the structure is fairly simple. First, a flat base color. On top of that, I add a slightly reddish layer that I mask using the bent normals. I add a bit of depth using ambient occlusion, and then I manually paint certain areas like eyelids, cheeks, nose, and ears. These parts tend to have more subsurface scattering or just a warmer tone. I also do this for joints like knees and elbows, which are generally more reddish. For the eyes, I create a new material and mask it using polygon fill. I repeat the same process for other parts of the character, adding base materials as I go. For the clothing, I rely on ID masks. This makes it really easy to swap materials, even on the same object. To add depth, I blend in curvature and ambient occlusion. For the inside of the mouth, I add a base material and again use ID masks. Doing it this way makes the whole workflow much faster. For the eyes, I make sure symmetry is enabled. I start by painting a black circle, then gradually add tones matching the reference character. Normally, eyes would just be one color, but I manually add subtle variations to create more depth. For example, I brighten the bottom part to give the feeling of glass catching light, and I darken the top part for a subtle shadow. I carefully paint the pupil, keeping it centered. Once that's in place, I adjust the surface properties of the material. Eyes are very reflective, so I reduce the roughness until they look glossy and realistic. For the lips, I paint them strongly with a thick brush, without worrying about precision. Even if the stroke looks messy at first, I then refine it, lowering the intensity to make it look natural. With the eraser, I fine-tune the edges so the lips blend smoothly with the skin. I also add small imperfections like freckles. At first, I make them strong and noticeable. Then I reduce the intensity so they integrate naturally. This gives more character to the face. On organic surfaces, I find this approach gives me much more control over the final result. For the hair, I basically follow the same approach as with the skin. I take the smart material I created for the previous character's hair, copy it, and adjust the colors. The structure of the hair material is much simpler than the skin. It has a base color, some color variations driven by world space normals, and I enhance the edges using curvature. But for this character, I wanted a bit more depth in the hair, so I experimented with different noise textures, stretching them to give the illusion of hair strands. That's the reason why I aligned all the hair UV islands in the same direction during unwrapping. This way, I can control the fiber orientation with a single texture. By scaling the noise map, I achieve the look of fine strands. I gradually adjust the intensity and the scale until I reach the result I want. It's a process of trial and error, but it produces a very interesting effect. Now, moving on to clothing. For clothes, I import a smart material I made for the other character and simply tweak the colors. These clothing materials rely partly on bent normals, but mostly on curvature and ambient occlusion to bring out details. For the logo on the shirt, I isolate the graphic I had created earlier with ChatGPT. In Inkscape, which is the vector software I use, I run an automatic vectorization. This gives me a much cleaner result. I export the image and bring it into Substance Painter directly on the shirt. Then I adjust the scale and position until it matches the reference. This workflow is pretty simple as long as you know how to use the right tools. Next, I start adding materials to smaller accessories: the bracelets, the watch, the sneakers, the headphones. As I mentioned before, ID masks save a huge amount of work here. For the headphone logo, I follow a similar process to the shirt logo. I find a cat image, vectorize it, and extract the alpha. Then I project it as a material, give it some depth with height, adjust the color, and even add a touch of emission, like it's glowing. At the beginning of this video, I mentioned that this character liked to decorate with gum stickers. So with that in mind, I use artificial intelligence to generate some sticker images. I make sure the quality is high and that the level of detail is right. Then I run an automatic vectorization to extract mainly the contour lines, which I'll later paint in Photoshop. I clean up the strokes, making sure everything is closed properly. Then I import all these images into Photoshop, place them on my canvas, and remove any that aren't suitable. For example, I can't keep Pikachu or Plants vs. Zombies characters. After filtering, I refine all the outlines until they're neat, and then I start filling them with flat colors using selection masks. This whole process was actually really relaxing and enjoyable for me. At this stage, we're not solving any technical problem. We're just playing with color and shape, which feels like a small reward after all the heavy work. It also helps connect with the character's personality. I add a gray background to make sure the stickers are filled properly with color. I also add a thin white outline, just like real stickers usually have. Then I export each sticker individually, one by one, into separate Photoshop tabs. After completing that, here is the final result: all the stickers we created. Once exported, I import them all into Substance Painter as textures. To apply them as stickers, I simply create a new material and load each image as the base color. From there, it's just a matter of adjusting scale and positioning them wherever I want on the character. For example, I place the first sticker on the shoulder. I adjust the scale, then create an anchor point so I can also vary the roughness and depth using height. That way, I can control each sticker properties individually. After that, it's just duplicating the material and swapping the image with the next sticker. It's simply about placing them one by one where I want them. And with that, my friends, we now have the character fully completed. At this point, the model is ready, and I hand it off to the team so they can begin rigging and animation. But as always, I'll like to make a small presentation of the character. I created an auto rig using AccuRig, and then posed it and prepared it in Blender. And before showing you the final renders, if you're enjoying this video, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. I'll be uploading more content about Blender, game art, and 3D printing. So let's go now and check how is the final result. This project took me around 44 hours in total. about 10 hours for the body and accessories, 9 hours for detailing, and 6 hours for retopology. The shoes alone took about 7 hours between blocking, detailing, and retopology. 1 hour and 30 minutes on UVs, almost 2 hours on export and baking, 6 for texturing, and 3 for presentation.
I'm tired, boss.
Looking back, there are some things I could have done better. For example, I shouldn't have started the retopology of the body before fully fixing the proportions. That mistake forced me to do extra work. And the most important thing, having a clear concept art from the beginning would have saved me a lot of time. So, if you're starting in this field, don't get frustrated by technical barriers or artistic limitations. This is a complex discipline, and even after years of experience, you'll always find new things to improve. And if you want to progress faster, buy my courses. I hope you enjoyed this video. I am the Parabox, and inside every vertex there is a universe of possibilities. See you in the next video.